Well, I definitely think that students' thoughts, their modes of action, their very way of thinking, not only their thoughts, but their way of thinking is shaped by history as such. And a few specific examples, sort of from my class, when we go over early on, sort of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. There, sort of those movements laid the basis for sort of rational thought. Those movements laid the basis for man's conception of natural rights. That is to say, sort of man has these rights because he could reason. And because he could reason, he is entitled to certain things: life, liberty, pursuit of property, happiness. And people assume that sort of man does have rights, but it's just what the course does is it teaches them where this derives from. Modernism, for example, actually instills much of the doubt in reason and rationality and progress. And that also is a hallmark of people's thought. When students ask me, and they do sometimes at the beginning, when students ask me sort of why is it important to learn history, and specifically sort of European history, I tell them that that oftentimes our very sort of our very identities are wrapped up with what took place in the past, who we are, what we say, what we think. I use the example specifically of the French Revolution, and students are surprised when I indicate to them that a whole notions of, let's say, left, right in politics, and that's used every day, actually has sort of a distinct historical source, that it derives from sort of the seating, the specific seating of the National Convention, which was one of the meeting bodies during the French Revolution. So that's just an example of how sort of our very language is impacted by history, and the very notion of the impossible becoming possible. That also derives from the French Revolution. Whenever I charge my students with certain tasks, I always ask them to sort of forge an argument rather than merely to describe an event. I'll give an example. Again, dealing with the French Revolution, one of the issues that I like to deal with the students, that I like the students to grapple with, is the notion of whether the French Revolution is a continuation of, or whether it's a break from, the Enlightenment. And in order to do that, I indicate to my students quite clearly, I am not interested in hearing about the Enlightenment nor about the French Revolution. That is a merely sort of descriptive paper. But what I want it to be, what I want you to do, is to actually engage both movements, to sort of have them interact, and from that then to forge your own argument. That is to say, bring in material. You're going to need to bring in material from each, but nonetheless to actually articulate your own thought process. When I indicate to students that history is a living, breathing entity, I want them to understand that that historical events themselves, the way that they're interpreted over time, changes. That I want to sort of imbue them with a spirit that that history requires constant investigation. The aspects of history, or the events of history, I should say, that resonate with me the most. One is certainly the French Revolution. And one of the reasons for that is because, again, sort of the notion of just the impact that it has had on the modern world. Not only in terms of laying the basis for politics, and what I mean by that is sort of following the French Revolution, no matter who you were, whether you were a Democrat, conservative, whether you were a dictator, whether you were an anarchist, the way in which you appealed to the people, the way in which you gained political power was by appealing to the people. There's no politician who does not say, I support the people, or I stand up for the people. And this very language this very source of political power derives ultimately from the French Revolution. The many sort of isms that we hear today, sort of feminism, modernism, liberalism, conservatism, fascism, National Socialism, communism, all of these isms, in a sense, they're all children of the French Revolution. That history is moved forward by large societal forces, war, for example, economic recovery, economic growth, economic depression, population changes, increases, decreases in trade, sort of these large social processes. I nonetheless also want to indicate to students that there are individuals who nonetheless came up with, for example, the inventions that allowed for industrialization. It was individuals stormed the Bastille. They marched on Versailles. Now, also, though, individuals are the ones who committed the Holocaust. And so it's a matter of considering how individuals impact the world around them in very profound ways, and to tap into sort of that energy that you could also, just like individuals, just like historical subjects that we've looked at in the course, have sought to change the world. You could do it today. I've taught at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, before coming to BMCC. And what I've noticed in terms of the difference in students, I've noticed a few sort of things. One, oftentimes the students, they are, well, first of all, they are frequently much more diverse. Not only in terms of background, nationality, but in terms of age, and in terms of just in general life experience. One of my favorite historical novels, and we actually discussed this in class yesterday, was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This novel proves the point that oftentimes professors are concerned about the amount of reading that they should assign to students in terms of sort of page numbers. And Frankenstein is a lengthy novel. It is, a lot of words. And yet, without fail, the novel energizes students in a way that nothing else does. That it proves the point that it's not necessarily the length of a reading that matters. It is whether the reading just resonates with the students themselves. And that is one of the reasons why I love Frankenstein. My upcoming book, and I'm in the process of contacting publishers at this point, is going to be called, tentatively at least, The Strangeness of Home, German Loss and Search for Identity in Hanover, 1943 to 1948. And what the project essentially entails is an investigation of the way in which Germans made the transition from the Third Reich to democracy. So it looks at those pivotal years that essentially embodied sort of the collapse of the Third Reich and the immediate post-World War II occupation years. And what I do is, in order to determine sort of how Germans are staking out identities, I look at the way in which they interact with each other, with displaced persons, that is to say with former sort of concentration camp inmates, prisoners of war. I see how they interact with Allied occupiers, with refugees from the East. So all of these groups are gathering in Hanover. And Hanover, the reason why I chose Hanover as a site was because not only was it destroyed in the war, but it also was a pivotal transit point. So many individuals were passing through, some were staying. But the point is that Hanover became a very alien, and in some cases sort of very terrifying place where you had a lot of strangers interacting with each other. And so through their interactions, so through sort of these sort of curbside sort of interactions, I look for how Germans are dealing with their past, dealing with their Nazi past, how they're coping with the present, and how they're coping with the future.